Well, Chief Zibolski, thank you so much for joining me today. I know you weren't here for the protests, but we did want to talk with at least someone from the police department to reflect on what happened. So, what you got here in October, right?
October 5th,
Yeah,
yes.
and I don't even think the interviews had been started when the protests happened in May, is that right?
No, they started in August. The process was published. Yeah, I think
Right.
that went on in April.
Yeah. And so, do you remember hearing about or watching the protests that happened in Fargo?
Sure, yeah, I mean, I was following it as part of the application process, so I did see what was, at least out in the video, in the media world, and following the articles and what was happening in town.
What did you think of it? What was going on?
Well, it was pretty surprising. I guess, in doing some of the research on the city, I don't think that I didn't pick up on those types of issues, and I don't know that a lot of people here actually thought that there was significant issues afoot until that erupted following the George Floyd incident. So I think that's, I guess, maybe a little bit of a wake-up call from the perspective of community relations and situational awareness in your community and that type of thing. So I think that the department responded as best as they could under the circumstances, and certainly there's a lot to be learned from that experience.
Going back, and I don't know how much you can talk about the incident itself since there are still some open cases, but what were some changes that had to be made from that incident? Just whether it was things that we did wrong or things that we felt needed to be improved upon, and basically because we never had an incident like that, at least at that level.
Well, and I think there's a lot, not just locally but nationally, that law enforcement is looking at in terms of how do we handle civil unrest, First Amendment, peaceable protests versus riotous activity. I think a lot of the tools, tactics, and techniques that law enforcement was familiar with when 2020 happened and George Floyd and all of these protests that followed happened were techniques, tools, and tactics that hadn't been used in a long time. As a result, they really hadn't been thought about, I don't think, in a long time, and it really limited, I think, the options that law enforcement had. Here in Fargo, you saw the same type of an approach. Certainly, we have to be diligent about protecting persons and property, but what's the best way to do that? And I think looking at a traditional tactic of putting a police line out, to put a police line out and attempt to kind of blocking off an area without a real goal or purpose in doing so, obviously is not, I would say, a good tactic going forward. What it did really is put the police in a position to be targets themselves. And so looking back at a lot of the things that happen, and we have to be able to, as a law enforcement agency, protect people and property, but also not unnecessarily interfere with peaceful protests. So as long as, that's what's happening, then we really don't need to be standing out there. But we also have to have the ability to quickly and tactically respond to situations where people or property are being damaged. And so that some of the discussions that we're having and some of the training things that we're talking about have to deal with, okay, we don't need to necessarily be standing out on a line, but when something happens, we have to have the ability to get there, make those necessary arrests to prevent other riot situations or damage from occurring, and then back out of that. So I think there's a whole new approach, and nationally, the International Association of Chiefs of Police has a subcommittee working on looking at tools, tactics, and techniques relative to civil unrest. As you know, I'm an ex officio member of the board and also the vice chair for the Mid-Sized Agencies Division in IACP, so we have a lot of those discussions. Those are ongoing, and I'm sure they'll be talking about those through the rest of the year. I would expect to see some new things coming out, from maybe different tools for law enforcement to use, but certainly different tactics and techniques.
Do you think there was a moment when things really started to turn, or something that really sparked the riots in Fargo? And what was that moment?
Well, I think from what I saw video-wise, that as soon as individuals felt it was safe for them to become aggressive and start damaging law enforcement vehicles, setting things on fire, damaging property, that was certainly a turning point, maybe not for the whole crowd, because we know that the whole crowd wasn't involved in that, but the tactic deployed by some of the agitators who were salted and peppered into this group, that was exactly their tactic, to use peaceful protest as a cover for their other goals, which were different. And so that is not something I don't think law enforcement had experienced before, and was certainly a turning point in creating more tension and hostility.
Mm-hmm. Some people have wondered why officers were wearing armor early in the day, and they saw that as a show of force. Why was that armor and other non-lethal display of weapons, why was that necessary?
Well, I wasn't here for that one, so I can't explain what the thought process was or what was going on. I would assume that they looked at the current situation and felt it was necessary to protect the officers. Not all officers had armor or any type of protective gear, so
right.
That's actually a misnomer.
Okay. Now, another thing was some of the people online, they mentioned hearing the 30-minute warning, and there were a lot of posts on Facebook and Twitter, especially Chief Todd's video about why the curfew was implemented. But a lot of the people that were in the protest said they felt that the reason for being dispersed was not communicated. Do you think the reason for dispersing was communicated to the crowd adequately?
Well, I'm really unable to answer that, but I think the whole discussion about curfews is also another piece that we're looking at as a city and nationally as well. I mean, if you're imposing a curfew for a specific reason, then I guess you have to be in a position to enforce the curfew, and is that beneficial if there's no other damage or harm being conducted? And I think that's, in terms of philosophy and how we would approach these kinds of things, is something that may change going forward. Because again, if we're just dispersing a crowd because of a curfew with no other criminal activity going on, that may not be the best approach.
And this is kind of another question along those lines. Some people have questioned whether, I don't know if you'd call it tear gas, maybe there's a better name for it, but that's what a lot of people called it, and a lot of the foam projectiles that were used. Well, why was that necessary?
Well, again, I can't answer that question except to say if they were trying to disperse the crowd, those are tools that they would use. We do not use tear gas.
Okay.
So it's either OC, which is oleoresin capsicum, like the mace type of spray that officers use,
Okay.
and then CS gas, which also is not, it's not as pungent as tear gas. And then the other rubber bullet types of things are, again, things to either de-escalate, move people, that type of thing. It depends on what's going on. So having not been here at the time those decisions were made, I'm not really able to answer that.
Mm-hmm. What did you think of the next day after seeing some of the damage? I mean, I know you weren't there in person probably, but how did that reflect on the city of Fargo as a whole, seeing all that damage?
Well, I think what actually reflected favorably on the city of Fargo is the photos I saw, are all the people that came down and helped cleaning up downtown. Cleaning up the damage, scrubbing off the graffiti. I think that was very, very positive for our overall community perspective. Obviously, the folks that caused the damage, they're criminals. And so to the extent they could be identified and charged, I think that's what the department did, and I would stand behind that. That's exactly what should have happened.
As far as interacting with people of color, how have policies changed since you've come here?
Well, I don't think I would say a policy change, but I think we're focused on a cultural change in the department. Growing community relationships and trust. Even prior to my start, our community engagement team did a lot of outreach with various communities who either were involved in the protest activities or had certain issues historically or currently with law enforcement. And so those outreach efforts are very important, and we've continued to sustain and enhance that across the department. Our new vision, mission, and values embraces those same type of philosophies. We've gone out in the community and held some community conversations on traffic stops, and now that the COVID cloud is kind of lifted, we'll be able to do more of that, because the engagement pieces with our community, public education in terms of items that cause conflict between law enforcement and the community, traffic stops, use of force, our body-worn camera program that'll be coming out, are important pieces, because a lot of times the conflicts are the result of, sometimes it can be a bad approach by law enforcement, but other times it's misinformation, misunderstanding of the person who is in the contact with the officer. They think they can or cannot do something because they saw it on social media or somebody told them, etc. And so to the extent we can educate people on that, so we have the same level of understanding, and the officer approaches the situation respectfully and uses their authority appropriately, that should eliminate a lot of the conflicts.
In the outreach and talking with different groups of people, how effective has that been in building trust with the community?
I think it's been very effective. Several of our community organizers work with us quite well in terms of communication. We're starting to grow those relationships. We are, discussing potential reforms, changes, that type of thing that are of interest on how can we move those items forward to some actionable outcomes. So I think that's going very well.
One of the things that city leaders said is they feel that a lot of the people that were starting the riots, they were outside agitators, and yet a lot of the people that were charged were from here. I think there was only 3 people from out of the metro area. Mm-hmm. Is there any evidence or anything the police department can show that would back up those claims of outside agitators, and what would that be?
Sure. Well, not that we can share. There's intelligence information that there was a large group of outside agitators. The fact that the only people arrested were local is really a meaningless fact, because not everyone that committed damage and caused injury got arrested or was identified. So we know from intelligence information that there was a group that was traversing through this area. They also went down to Sioux Falls and over to the Twin Cities. So again, if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. The outside agitators are smart enough to start the action and then step back and let other people take over. And a lot of times, by the time the cops are able to get to the position to take action, now who do we end up arresting? Mm-hmm. The second in line, right? The agitators are already moving on and committing chaos somewhere else. So there is a group of them out there, or there was, involved in a lot of these things at a national level.
I was at the rally on Tuesday, and they were talking about how this is about the community coming to leaders and talking about how the leaders are serving them and making sure they are listening to mm-hmm. what the people need. How do you think the police department has, in the last year or so, how well do you think they've done at listening to what the community needs?
I think in the last 8 months we've done very well. We have regular meetings with several of our community organizers and those groups. We have regular outreach. We're working with the Human Relations Committee and the Commission, not only on hate crime ordinance, potential hate crime ordinances, but also in discussing with them demographic data that's of interest to the public, traffic stops, use of force, that kind of stuff. So the department is gearing up from a data perspective to start to be able to grab that information. And then the big part is, once you have that information, what's the context and what is the meaning to it? So there's a lot of, again, that's a larger conversation. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about data and what it means. So again, to the extent we continue to do that, that's going to alleviate a lot of concerns. It also may identify some processes that should change to benefit everyone. So I'm kind of looking forward to watching that play out.
What do you think people who look back on the protests and the riots in Fargo, what do you think they miss, and what do you want them to remember about it?
Well, I think, and just in terms of looking back at the events, obviously we wouldn't want to repeat that event. So I think the important piece is that, and I think we understand this from the city and the law enforcement perspective, and I think a lot of our community groups do as well, that the way to achieve resolution and something that's long-lasting is through collaboration, cooperation, and consensus. It is not through conflict. And so, the idea of destroying property or hurting people to attain a resolution is not only unlawful, but it's not going to be successful. It's not going to help. It's not going to be long-standing. We know that the best long-lasting behavior is that positive behavior, though. So as we continue to work together, we've got stronger bonds, we've got greater sustainability, and we'll be able to grow from there as a community.
Well, I think that's all I have for you, Chief Zibolski, unless if you want to add anything.
I think I'm good. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you so much for
Yeah.
joining.